What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological goodness so you can think, reflect, and wrestle with your own faith. And today, returning to the podcast, is the Reverend Brian Zahnd, author of The Wood Between Worlds. We're on here talking about his brand new book, exploring theopoetics of the cross. And not just that. We take a little extra time on his chapter, looking at the ring, Tolkien style. But before we jump in, I want to tell you two things. Number one, Brian Zahnd is joining us at Theology Beer Camp this October 17th and 19th in Denver, Colorado. So if you want to come hang out with Brian Zahnd and Brian McLaren, you could double your Brian right there. If you want to see Catherine Keller, John Tatominal, Ilya Dilio, Grace G. Sun Kim, Adam Clark, Jorg Rieger, all these scholars you've got to hang out with on the podcast. You want to do it in person? Come to Theology Beer Camp. If you want to hang out with 30 plus other God pods, like our friends at the Bible for Normal People, you have permission. The new evangelicals rethinking faith. Look, the lists are huge. Just go to theologybeer.camp and you'll see it. And guess what? There's tons of new stuff going down this year. Oh, it's going to be awesome. And we're going to have some music. That's right. Flamey Grant, Ivy King, and Kevin Max are going to all be performing. So go to theologybeer.camp, join up, keep it zesty, and guess what's on your horizon? It's part of the process this series. This first time we've been doing a whole series of interviews exploring topics from different angles. The one we're doing right now with Kester Bruin, we are doing a series of interviews on artificial intelligence. This is what's on the horizon. An interview with a leading lawmaker exploring regulating AI, a leader, like a Nobel Prize-winning economist thinking about the impact of AI, multiple philosophical perspectives on technology, from Heidegger to Jacques Ellul to Teilhard. All that is coming your way. And if you want to get all those episodes, in every Homebrewed episode ad-free, you want to get the extended time on the ones where there's bonus conversation, and you want to be able to interact directly, send questions, all that kind of stuff, join us live for the big wrap-up convo, all that kind of stuff. Head to processthis.substack.com and join up. It'd be a good time. And plus, there's only 70-some thousand people already on the Substack. You can be one of the others. Or one of the elect who join up and become a supporting member. Anyway, thank you, Brian, for coming on the podcast. Super pumped. Get you on stage for karaoke at Theology Beer Camp. Enjoy, friends. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Brian Zahnd, who was on recently having a fun time with me and Dom, and before that, got to record in person in Edinburgh. But he's back with some theopoetics of the cross, his new book, The Wood Between Worlds, a book so pretty, even if you got the advanced reader copy, you go ahead and buy it. Is that the trick that was going on, Brian?
Man, it is. I don't know if they give awards for like book cover design. If they do, this one should win them all. I mean, I had nothing to do with it, but other than, maybe the content inspired the designer, but man, it really is gorgeous, right? I mean, it is.
Yeah.
This is the one occasion where I hope that you can judge the book by its cover.
Well, sometimes I judge books by their chapter titles, and, can you guess what chapter title? I was just
One Ring to Rule Them All.
Oh, you guessed it. That's right. That is right. One Ring to Rule Them All. Now, I will say for listeners, I'm not going to talk about Lord of the Rings with Brian the entire time. But I actually think it's a fun place to begin. You were working on that when we had a live stream back a few years ago around Lord of the Rings and theology and such, and you came on and read us a little bit of it. So I was eagerly anticipating it. But I'll tell you, I waited. I didn't just skip to that chapter. You know,
Yeah.
I didn't.
No, that's good.
I,
Yeah, you don't want to just jump into it.
No, you got to savor it. It's like people, it would be like people skipping the Council of Elrond when they're reading Lord of the Rings, and you're like, what is your problem?
Yeah.
But when you think of all that as a minister and who's been, spending more and more time in kind of engaging in the public square and thinking about using books as a way of communicating and not just sermons and such, what is it about our conversation as a people of faith around the cross that was frustrating, problematic enough that you dedicated a book to unpacking its beauty?
Well, I've always worked with art. I mean, I just, music, literature, all that sort of thing, painting. I mean, it's just, that's in me. I love that sort of thing. I'd written a lot where I would regularly reference, metaphorically, I guess, Caesar's sword, the sword of Caesar, all that. I think people, it doesn't really engage their imagination that much, and maybe they're dismissive of it or tired of it. So I just switched to the Ring of Power. And I think maybe that gives it new currency, and people, oh, yeah, I see how that works. That ring will corrupt you. And that's why I say in that chapter, I said, probably the most resonant theme I find in The Lord of the Rings is the absolute inability to use the ring for good, and its total capacity to corrupt whoever bears it. And so that's good material for me to work with when I'm wanting to write about how I think the church should and should not engage in the political world.
And one of the things about the ring itself is the way it doesn't like show up as a foreign invasion to the person's will. It latches on to who they are, what's their duty and responsibility in the story. So for the different leaders of nations, it's a different kind of temptation. If you're like Gandalf and you have a different temptation, like he and Galadriel have different kinds of powers and responsibilities that function. Sam, it's like, I'm gonna garden so dominant that no one will be able to hold my hoe and spatula. So it has this sense of the particular power and perversity of it is connected to who the person is.
Gandalf says, the way of the ring to me would be through pity and a desire to do good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, you can connect that with the wilderness temptations of Christ. In the wilderness temptation, the devil isn't tempting Jesus with evil. He's tempting him with good. Come on. I mean, feed people, turn stones to bread, just feed the masses. Go ahead and just prove who you are. Do that. And rule the world. Just rule the world. You'll be great at it. You'll do good, and that's how that temptation works.
And that temptation is something that a way of thinking it through is a temptation to embody your identity in an alternative narrative to the way of the cross, right? So Jesus, those temptations are like different ways of being the Christ or being the Messiah.
Yeah.
Like, Satan's like, if you just bow your knee to me, like, you know how much power Caesar has? Just imagine like the Son of God. Like love incarnate. Yeah. Like if you had that would be great, right? And so the temptations are these other ways of being it, and I find some of the biggest problems that exist theologically are come from places where we've refused to let God's own self-revelation in Christ thematize our understanding of God and God's place, identity, and work in the world.
Yeah, and let's stick with that third temptation for just a second. The story's told one way, but think of it like this. I mean, Jesus is contemplating how he's going to go about his ministry. We'll skip over the first two, Matthew's order of them, go to that third temptation, And it's, raise an army, drive out the Romans, maybe march on Rome itself and become Jesus the Great, all for the sake of goodness, all for the sake of relieving oppression. And it's in this moment, though, as Jesus contemplates employing violence toward a good end, that he understands, that would be to bow down to the devil. It isn't, I don't think of it as, I worship you, Satan, and now I have it. It's rather that to pursue that end, to say, I'm for the sake of the good, I'm going to employ violence. That's to bow down to the devil. I won't do that.
Yeah. In that contrast, right, from being one who builds crosses versus one that bears ones, is a contrast that raises all the ways in which Christians in America inherit a web of complicity, and it generates a kind of mirror where our ideological commitments that may be unexamined show that we might have a deeper allegiance to the power and place of our nation in the world than our commitment to follow after the way of Jesus.
Christian nationalism is just nationalism. There's nothing Christian about it other than it's a brand or something like that, but it's just nationalism.
You've had a career where on repeated occasions you've created some angst in the people that introduced you to Christ and your kind of Jesus people experience to today. When you think of that temptation that Jesus faced and we face as a church today, especially those of us citizens of our current imperial structure, what have you learned about the way we are just born into, informed, indoctrinated into it, and what it's like to get honest about it, come to grips, and be called beyond it?
Well, let me reply. Let me think about this. When in mid-age, around the age of 40 or something like that, I began to lead Word of Life Church, the church that I've now led for 42 years. At that point, it was like 20-some years, in a new direction. There was a lot of theological changes. I was making a lot of changes, but almost everybody was fine with it. All right, let's do this, let's do that, let's be more sacramental, all of that. It was when I began to preach that America is not a kind of biblical Israel, but a kind of biblical Babylon. Well, that's when I lost over 1,000 people. And I thought, well, okay, so that's where a real deep devotion lies. And when you think about America is a behemoth. It's a big thing. And it's not just one thing. It's four things. It's a nation, with its 50 states and borders and all of that. It's a culture, right? I travel the world a lot, but I never leave America. Outside, it's America. There's a culture that's global now. It's an empire, by which I mean, I use the word empire not just loosely. I describe it as empires are rich, powerful nations who believe they have a manifest destiny to shape history and a divine right to rule other nations. We could talk more about that or not, but finally, America is a religion, and that may sound provocative, probably is, but it's also true. Complete with foundation myths and founding fathers and holy sites and holy documents and holy days and the apotheosis of Washington in the Capitol Rotunda. And once you realize that America has a deep religious component, because, the idea was America was not going to have a state church. I'm all for that, by the way, except the religious impulse remains. And it gets poured directly into a particular vision of America. And so what I'm trying to do as a pastor and others is really it verges on an impossible task. We still bravely soldier on, but we're trying to make disciples for Jesus, of people who are already thoroughly discipled into a rival religion. And let me back up it, because that sounds too. When I say America is a nation and a culture, it's a mixed bag, but there's much to celebrate. There's a lot of things that are good. And so, I'm not, people say, you just hate America. I say, I don't hate America. It's my home. It's my people. It's mine, it's where I belong. But in the light of Christ, I can critique it. So as a nation and culture, it's a mixed bag, but there's much to celebrate. As an empire, it presents itself as a rival to the kingdom of Christ, and as a religion, it's idolatrous.
Mm-hmm. In that idolatrous element, how has your understanding of it, and maybe the way you have encountered and had to struggle with it as a leader at the congregational level, changed over the last 10 years or so?
For me, it's gotten easier. Because what happened was we were really making these changes in, let's say, 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, around that period of time. And it just became clear, okay, Word of Life Church is not a God and country thing. BZ is going to be pretty radical on that, and we uncoupled ourselves from that sort of
you didn't have that
entanglement with the American empire. So that the Trump era, for us, just our own local church, has not really been an issue. It hasn't created much tension or problem within our church. And let me say this, our church is not a political monolith. If you do pastor you're all right or you're all left, I mean, you can maintain cohesion within the congregation. Now, I think you'll have other problems, but Word of Life isn't that. I mean, I'm in St. Joseph, Missouri, Missouri, okay? Missouri. So we kind of, I don't know, we're not going to ask them. We don't poll people, what are your politics? But I just know that we have a fairly broad spectrum. But what has happened, and it wasn't like a program we set out to employ or install, but it happened over that Word of Life, and I just mean this honestly, Word of Life has a culture of kindness. Culture is what it's what you do without thinking about it. You don't have to, your culture is where you're at home. You just, this is how we do things here. And when you go to another culture, you're trying to find your bearings and what should I say or not do. At Word of Life, you can kind of, we're not going to dictate to you what your politics need to be, but the culture says you got to be kind about it. If you're mean, if you're ugly, if you're insulting, if you're demeaning to others in the name of your politics, at Word of Life, that's like, well, we're not like that here. And that has been a huge saving grace. And I don't know, how we got there, other than maybe the way we lean into Jesus and the Gospels and the Beatitudes, and that just over time formed people in that.
Mm-hmm. What's been the experience of those maybe who are connected to a church that's able to do something a lot of those around it can't? I moved back recently to the South and haven't been here for 15 years, and it's been quite a doozy rediscovering that my sweeping judgments I made off people's Facebook feeds was actually worse than anticipated. And one of those tensions is when you're grounded in a community that doesn't have a toxic connection of nationalism and Jesus at its heart, it can create increasing amount of tensions with people who you used to think of as part of your deepest community. Do you have thoughts on that struggle for yourself, congregants, when the church itself is in one place, but what's going on around you and this kind of intensification and tribalization puts external pressures on things?
Yeah, I know what I want to say, and I want to be careful about it. at Word of Life, we really do have a sense that part of our vocation, I'm not saying I'm not being funny. I'm not trying to be cute. Definitely not trying to be arrogant, but we see part of our mission as to evangelize Christians. And there's so many that really have not yet heard the good news or seen the beautiful Savior who's Jesus Christ. And so rather than, I haven't had much success at all in being deliberately confrontational. That doesn't work. Now, I'm a little bit more of that in my books. Here's what I do know. My most vehement critics don't actually read my book. So I can say whatever I want because they're not going to read them anyway. I'm a little more forthcoming in that, but in pastoring a local church, you let those that have ears to hear. And those that don't have ears, I'll give you an example. So it is Lent, and I do have this book out, and I do preach and all that business. And so I'm preaching certain chapters, turning them into sermons during this time. I'm looking up here. Where is that chapter? One ring to rule them all. And so in the book, I directly quote, Donald Trump's speech there in Iowa. This is the place where, I could stand in Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose a support.
Yeah, you got to name them. There's a legion of quotes you could use.
Well, okay. So what I did was I talked about in my sermon. I mean, in the book, I just, Donald Trump does this, and this is a speech from Mordor. This is, I'll give you the power. If I'm in office, you're going to have power. Christianity's going to have power. You're going to have plenty of power. In the book, I tell you what I'm doing. In preaching, and I still quoted it exactly, but I said, look, when politicians, whether it's Constantine, Charlemagne, or contemporary politicians, say things like this, you understand you're hearing a speech from Mordor, and it's a temptation that must be rejected. Say, no, thank you, Mr. Politician. We have a different kind of power, the keys of the kingdom and the Holy Spirit. So it's a Sunday morning. We're also there. We're there to worship. We're there for the sacrament. We're there to have a place that is other and not just another barracks in the culture wars. So I can't address these things, but I tell it a little bit more slant. And those that have ears to hear, and maybe they move in a better direction. Those that don't. What are you going to do? You're not going to do anything. So I approach it like that, and it just hasn't been a problem. Now, I hear I'm on this podcast letting the cat out of the bag, but these people don't listen to these podcasts either. They're not listening to home Christianity. The people.
Oh, come on!
This is not on the MAGA radar.
Are you sure?
I hate to disappoint you, Trip.
I get a few hate listeners, and they send me edifying messages.
Well,
it's when they include your physical address that I get uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I'm like, well, is this what Jesus told you to do? In the book itself,
I've had death threats. I'm not going to tell too much of the story. I've had the FBI show up and tell me, this guy really wants to kill you. And I said, well, can you take away his guns? Well, that's hard.
It's hard.
It's a long story. But yeah, I know what that's like.
Do you know what got him upset?
This stuff.
Because sometimes I had an individual recently who is a lawyer on for Trump's election team email me rather lengthy threats, and I realized that this individual, a male, was really, really upset in a conversation in like multiple episodes where Diana Butler Bass and I had talked, and he was really upset about her, and I wanted to reply and be like, I find it fascinating that the female's the one you're worked up about when she's more conservative than me politically, and yet you can't figure out where she lives, so you're sending me these things, and I was like, look, there's only one of us that's a like very committed Christian socialist. And it's not her. Like, you just didn't even listen well. Like, I mean, I'm sure there are ways that she's triggering you. And I find that like whatever it is in that triggers someone to invest a 1,800 word email, screed at you, like whatever that energy is that actually generates a kind of pity for that person. And you wonder, like, what has happened that your own kind of self-understanding and identity and place in the world is so threatened by two people talking on the internet that you're going to use your legal education, online snooping and stuff to terrorize them. And that's like the other element, of pity that runs throughout the Christian tradition, right? That Jesus being moved to compassion and things, but it's also an element that, when you mention Gandalf's, like his temptation is to pity. But like part of the pity that runs throughout the Lord of the Rings is the challenge Gandalf gives to Frodo and to Bilbo, with this sense of, like, you think you actually have the God's eye perspective and can decide who lives or who dies. And it's they to look at the world and inscribe other people into a final accounting of their existence. It's problematized in a really deep way.
Yeah, and when I use the Lord of the Rings as a metaphor for turning away from political coercion and violence, people immediately say, well, wait a minute, there's a lot of battles in the Lord of the Rings. Indeed, there are. But the point is, they didn't kill Gollum. That Gandalf and Frodo said, no, we could, we're not going to. And that's where they're staying their hand and saying, no, we're not following that kind of direct path of violence. And because that is, I think you do that, then you already are doing the bidding of the ring, and then you just take the ring, and then you're the next Gollum or Saruman or whatever.
Yeah,
Sauron.
And even though there are battles and stuff throughout it, right? Like part of what Tolkien is doing is one, introducing, right, like horizons of honor and duty in all of those places.
That's great.
But the stories of the powerful are elaborate distractions for two people who only survived the journey with the ring and Gollum because they refused to leave their friend behind, right? And so, like, the real undoing of things is the ring's drive to be found is ultimately its death drive, and that like when you have deep friendships in a home worth giving yourselves for its survival, you can endure Mordor, right? So like,
this is good stuff, Trip. This is good stuff.
No, I just like in the movies, unlike the books, spend a lot more time on the battles because you're using film. But like if you read the books, like the whole Battle of Helm's Deep is as long as one of Frodo and Sam's conversations walking through Mordor that make you tear up if you're a decent human.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Do you like, in thinking about?
By the way, just so you'll know, I probably already mentioned this, but it was you. I think it was maybe something you put on Twitter, but I don't. You're the one that alerted me to the Andy Serkis narrated Lord of the Rings. My goodness.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Whew. I mean, even if you have listened to Lord of the Rings, if it was some other narrator, do yourself a favor and listen to Andy Serkis' narration of the Lord of the Rings. That's phenomenal.
Oh, it is. It is. They're beautiful. Like I'm the kind of person that if they released a 70 LP version of him reading Lord of the Rings, and there's a whole book on my shelf of just sticking the records on and playing it while I sit there and listen and maybe read along with him, I would do it. I would do it. Just think of how many cool pieces of art would be in that record set.
I'm not a big audiobook listener, but I do when I have this 6 mile walk I like to do as many days a week as I actually do it. So that's, a little over an hour and a half. So that's when I listen.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was there were so many times listening to Lord of the Rings that I'm walking and the tears are coming down my face and I'm embarrassed. I'm hoping nobody notices, that I'm actually weeping as I walk because some of the places are so beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the elements that's in Lord of the Rings that is also at the very heart of the gospel story that gets covered over when solutions to our biggest predicaments are inscribed in a kind of coercive power is friendship.
Yeah.
And obviously the hobbits themselves play a part of it in Lord of the Rings, and Jesus and his disciples, Jesus and Mary and Martha and Lazarus, that there's this kind of that friendships bring in the texture of vulnerability and risk at the heart of living, that's ultimately expressed in Jesus' own vulnerability in death at the cross. When you think of that kind of relational vulnerability, the gift of friends for living before you die, what gets opened up when our vision of the divine as the omnipotent, unchanging, protected one is cracked by the cross of a vulnerable Lord?
I think we can bear almost anything if we can do it in the company of our friends. And the only theodicy for me, I don't know if there is a theodicy that really works, that's fully satisfying. I don't know of it. But the component that actually does bring some solace is that God in Christ has chosen to suffer with us, and we don't suffer alone. And there is that moment, there is that eternal moment where the Son of God suffers in solidarity with all who suffer. And some might think that's shallow and cheap solace. I don't think so. I think we could line up a lot of people that would say, no, that really has helped me. And Peter sort of cryptically refers to this when he says famously, by his wounds we are healed. And so that when we bring our wounds, we'll use friendship, when we bring our wounds to the friend of sinners who suffers with us, when we bring our wounds to the wounds of Christ, somehow it doesn't multiply woundedness, but trends toward healing. So Christ is the crucified one, and this is the supreme moment of self-disclosure from God. There's a sentence I use in the book that I actually use in like all of my books. I think it's in at least 10, maybe 11 books I've used this exact same sentence. And it's kind of a game I play, sort of, because I wonder if anybody's ever going to catch it, if some editor's going to, haven't you said that before? Yeah, I say it every time. And what it is it is a paraphrase from it's a summation paraphrase of a paragraph out of Hans Urs von Balthasar's Love Alone is Credible. And the first time, several times that I quoted it, I connected it with that book and Hans Urs von Balthasar. Lately, I just dropped the sentence in. But the sentence goes like this: being disguised under the disfigurement of an ugly crucifixion and death, Christ upon the cross is paradoxically the clearest revelation of who God is. I love that sentence. I mean, and so that's why I use it in like every book I write. But of course in this one, because it's directly about that, I think we can become sort of dulled to that, but that the supreme moment of self-disclosure is God in Christ allowing himself to be crucified to fully participate in solidarity with human suffering. I mean, there's other things going on too. That's part of the point of the book. But that certainly is, the that also is present. Since I just landed at that moment, let me say this, that in setting out to write a book on the cross, the thing I really wasn't going to do, have no desire to do, is to say, okay, this is the atonement theory, and then be combative towards any other.
You got to wait till your next book to do that. That's when you.
Any other ways of thinking or talking about the cross, or there's okay, here's the four, and you can pick which one you like. No, I don't like any of that. I think we stand in awe, we stand in reverence, and I talk about it. I talk about being kaleidoscopic. You take a kaleidoscope, you look through it at the source of light, you see colors in a design, but then you turn the kaleidoscope, you're still looking at the same source of light. It's the same light, but now there's a different geometric design and different colors. And that's what I'm doing with the cross, because I don't want to just, okay, I can sum up the cross in a dogmatic sentence or two and, okay, we're done. No, that seems very dismissive.
Mm-hmm. Well, even like the decision to think about it using the framing of theopoetics versus theology, like one of the distinctions, and I think people often miss like poetics, like just like poesis is a making, it's a creative making, it's an activity, it's something that you're doing, and so often the cross, once it's processed theologically, it's a conclusion, and it's something you either like check yes or no to, or maybe you have 4 options or 5 options of here's your atonement theories, and here's let's prioritize them or tell us which one's true. And that notion of theopoetics is like inherently participatory. It's necessarily contextual in the sense that to do poetics is to be engaged in the making. And then to say that for Christians, to think theopoetically is to think in the entanglement with the cross at the very center, right? And so much of what happens in the book, be it like, engaging Lord of the Rings, but also like engaging Scripture throughout and all these different stories and narratives that are there, and thinking about the life of Jesus and how the temptations goes, like when our creative making and wrestling with all that is getting itself done in the gospel story is done so at the foot of the cross, it reorients that activity and reshapes the kinds of questions and that drive us. And I think you're pointing at something that's really important, because the consequences of a theology disentangled from the cross is a generation of a theology that will blindly build them.
Wow, it's good. So it's subtitled A Poetic Theology of the Cross. I think it's fine. It's not a book of poetry. I mean,
right.
There is some poetry in it, and I reference some poetry, but it's not a book of poetry. I'm using poetry in a pretty wide sense in that I reference a lot of literature, film, song, paintings, all of that, because I didn't want to write. First of all, I'm not from the academy. I'm not vetted. So I don't necessarily want to write in academic prose. I can read it. I'm not intimidated by it. I know it, but that's not what I traffic in. And plus, I just think in modernity, there's been this over-infatuation with academic prose. It has its place. I get it. But it's when we are attempting to speak of the ineffable, I think, eventually you just reach the end of prose. And then all that's left is a more poetic approach. In poetic, I mean, I'm also including other forms of art. And I think that's I know it's completely legitimate. And so, so that's what was the impulse there. But in writing it, I want to stress, I wasn't like, oh, okay, in this chapter, like I outlined it. In this chapter, I'll reference A Hidden Life, Terrence Malick's film. And in this, I'll use John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. It's just, as I sat to write on these things, oh, that popped up, and that popped up, and that popped up. I mean, when I sat out to write a book, I didn't know that I would work with The Lord of the Rings. It just, because I don't really outline them that much. I have a kind of an idea of where I'm going to go. Sometimes you write to find out what you actually do believe. I think I believe some things about this. What do I believe? Well, you start writing and you find out. But then that reservoir of an appreciation for film and music and painting and all that just sort of bubbles to the surface at that moment when you're reaching for something, a way to communicate something that you've just come to the end of with prose. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I think part of it is there are two ideas around this that I find fascinating. One, like in the book, whatever, publicity stuff, it talks about, the cross is at the heart of Scripture. But I think it's also, the book is making a claim that at the heart of Scripture is claiming the cross is at the heart of the cosmos, and it's unfolding story.
Plato even said that.
Yeah, and
I mean, who knows what he actually meant, but he did say that.
Yeah, and I think that part of what happens when we take culture and the arts seriously, especially after Christendom, is that part of human dignity is to bear the image of God and to be addressed. Like the structure of being human is that we know we are finite, and that occasions questions of ultimacy. That we're born into a world and we're a species that inherit symbolic relations and are always interpreting what's in front of us in a web of values and beauty and truth and visions of justice. And like, to be human is to be addressed. And we don't stop asking the big questions that are a part of that dignity when we walk out of our cathedral or our sanctuary or our church. And one of the things I think you do well, as someone that regularly has sent people sermons and rolls their eyes at how lots of clergy do this, is it those elements in pop culture, say like music or film or these kinds of things, are occasions to give the theological answer one already had at the ready, and so in some sense, culture, if in scare quotes, secular culture, becomes an occasion to project upon it the solution to the problem they don't know they have. And one of the things that,
but that's propaganda.
Right.
That's not art.
And part of what putting the cross at the center of existence is that is the symbol that captures the struggle of being human, and and it's in the cross that God has solidarity in that material experience. And then, but who is it that can raise that question in ways that are compelling? Yeah, maybe it's a Terrence Malick film. Maybe it's sitting and looking at one of your giant playlist of Bob Dylan tunes. Maybe it's like you start going through culture, and to me, to be as Christocentric as you are and understanding it, and in this kind of frame of theopoetics, actually makes you a theologian of culture that takes the actual expression of what's getting itself done in these different arts seriously.
Yeah, I think if preachers attempt that, they have to be careful. You can't do it to look hip. It has to come from a genuine place of love. You have to know the subject matter well and love it. So I've done this. I know it's corny, but it's popular and it works. I've done it for, I don't know, like 14 years. It started out finding God on your iPod, which, kind of rhymes.
Now it's finding your iPod so that you can find God.
So, it's real generic and, finding God in the music, but still it's wildly popular. And people will all the time make suggestions. You should use this song. You should use it. And I say, Dad, it doesn't work that way. I have to love the song. I can't go out and find one to use to make my point, because it won't. There's no spark there. There's no magic. And so I say, admittedly, the music I use is kind of a fairly narrow genre. I'm not necessarily, trying to be as diverse as I can, because I can't approach those other forms genuinely, sincerely, authentically. That would be kind of, I don't know. So it has to come from a film I love, a music I love, a painting I actually just really love. I don't go looking for them. I'm aware of this painting and it moves me, or this poetry moves me. And then I can work with that. And let me just stay here a second longer. And so, you have Plato and Plotinus, the good, the true, the beautiful. And then later philosophers call these the transcendentals. And we want the true because it's true. It doesn't have to serve any other utilitarian end. Why do you want the true? Because it's true. Why do you want the good? Because it's good. Why do you want the beautiful? Because it's beautiful. It doesn't have to do anything else. It doesn't have to serve some other end. And so then out of that emerge Christian apologetics, defense of the truth, Christian ethics, attempting to define the good in the light of Christ, and then Christian aesthetic. Christian apologetics and Christian ethics has a long history. It has its place. Christian apologetics always, that's something we're going to engage in. Now, it needs to be done well. I don't mean the pop apologetics. And lately what I've seen is people call themselves apologists when they're just the worst of crank. And they're just defending a particular, tribalistic interpretation. That's not apologetics.
It's more of a signal of the conclusions they have before you read anything rather than the endeavor they're, engaging in.
Yeah, so it needs to be done well, not like that. And then there's Christian ethics, and that's essentially what has been Stanley Hauerwas's project. But at this particular moment, if we actually, if I lead a church and I'm actually desiring people to be attracted to Christ and to follow him, I can tell you, I've reached the point where I can't stand in the marketplace of ideas and make this announcement. Hello, everybody. We have absolute truth, and we know what's good for you. And we meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. That's not going to work. You just get flipped off, So, but beauty, that leaves the Christian aesthetics, which the church has been hit and miss with. Sometimes the church has done that well. Sometimes it hasn't. But I think it's the avenue that remains open at this point. And if we can communicate beauty, enact a beauty, and we don't get to say, and we're not the ones we don't get to stand there and shout at people and say, this is beautiful, damn it, recognize it, and just appreciate how beautiful this is. No, we just present it, and then they are the judges. Oh, that's beautiful. Or not. And so can we tell the story of Jesus in a way that people go, that's beautiful. And then hopefully even more, could we, to some degree, enact a life in imitation of Christ that people say, well, say what you will about those people. I think that's beautiful. I don't see any other way forward than that. And that touches on one of the phenomenons of the cross that I think easily we overlook is that which was, when the Romans are crucifying people, and they're not trying to do art. They are psychologically terrorizing oppressed people and sending a message, if you resist Rome, this is what's going to happen to you. And it was as ugly as possible. And yet we are very capable now of, there's a reason why crucifixion scenes and crucifixes hang in the Louvre, because they're beautiful. If the cross and the crucifixion of Christ can be depicted in terms of beauty that is not propaganda, it's not kitsch, but we still understand this is a crucifixion, but we also see the beauty. I think that says something very profound, very powerful.
So when you think of what's coming up for you as we're recording this in the next few weeks of Holy Week, from Palm Sunday through Easter Sunday, what kind of questions in your, as you're stewarding a community through it, do you bring that maybe you didn't earlier in your ministry, like the kind of intuitions that are being expressed in the book? How do they get expressed in Holy Week?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I began early on, and I began quite early, I mean, I just had inherited the theology that was passed on, and I just saw the crucifixion more or less as an essential factor in an atonement equation. That Jesus had to die so we could be forgiven. Okay. But this is the problem with so many Jesus movies, is you never quite figure out why they're killing this guy. And so what I've done, and I mentioned it when we did the thing with Dom Crossan, is I took the book that he wrote. I think he also wrote it with Marcus Borg, right? The Final Week is the name of it.
I think it's
And
last week.
The last week, yeah. And I've done it for so many years now. I don't go back to the book anymore because I know it pretty well. But what we do is we have services every day, every evening, and we just walk through that. Here's what happens on Monday. Here's what, and you the tension builds, and you see, oh, Jesus is confronting these institutions. He's a challenge to the Roman Empire. He's a challenge. It's a challenge to the Sanhedrin that is in collaborating with the Roman Empire, and that's where they're actually gaining their power. And so I walked the church through that. And then, I mean, just, like 45 minutes a day, we go through that. Here's what happens on Tuesday. Here's Wednesday. Here's Thursday. Here's Friday. It leaves it a little more open-ended, and people then can begin to connect various dots, and they say, oh, I see how this continues to speak. The principalities and powers aren't that different today, are they? It's kind of still the same thing. I bet you they'd try to crucify Jesus again, but you don't have to say that blunt. It's people begin to see it. And so what I do during Holy Week is an attempt to sort of let's walk with Jesus through the week and try. I mean, it's just, you're just trying. That's all you can do. Trying to see what he saw, feel what he felt, sense the people around him. What was it like? Why is Mary of Bethany taking this outrageous, perfume that costs a year's wages? Who is this woman? But she's pouring it on Jesus, like all in one go. And now Judas is really upset about this. Well, they're all upset, but Judas is upset, and Judas is, okay, this is the moment. Oh yeah. The story itself is so compelling. If we can just tell the story somewhat well, it has attractive properties, and people will be drawn into the story. So I don't have to task myself with requiring people to reach a certain conclusion. I'm just telling the story as artfully and as well as I can, as compellingly as I can, and let people be drawn into the story. And then the story, by which I mean the gospel, actually does its own work on people.
Yeah. Yeah. But here's the idea that was music related, I thought would be a fun final question. So let's imagine this eschatological banquet. Mm-hmm. You get there and Jesus sitting there and is like, Brian, I have amazing resources. There's nothing quite like conquering sin, law, and death when it goes to bringing together the greatest musicians of all time. We were hoping maybe in like 13,000 years when it's your turn to preach Easter Sunday. We thought, well, how about instead of just like preaching a sermon, it's Zahnd Fest. Like you get to pick any 5 bands for a music festival.
Oh,
Easter
right.
Music Festival. So when the vigil starts on Saturday night, these bands are playing. It ends, boom, sunrise. But we need bands that are going to rock it from sundown Saturday until you announce he's risen indeed Sunday morning at the eschatological banquet. There's still like a sun. So I don't know, but when if you were tasked and you get 5 bands They're all going to say yes, and you can even be specific on particular lineups or what tour they're on, because this is a perk of eschatological utility.
Yes.
Yeah.
At first, I thought you were just going to ask for a single song.
Oh no!
And my song was going to be "Green Grass and High Tides Forever" by the Outlaws. Just eschatological completion. It's just green grass and high tides forever, brother. And with these, that guitar army just going nuts for 10 minutes. But no, so it's 5 bands. All right, so we got a lineup. Well, Zeppelin's going to probably be the closer. We're going to close with Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin, the gods of rock. Right? The gods of rock. That leaves
this is when Robert
others.
Plant still could hit all the notes. Led Zeppelin.
Oh yeah, this is circa 1973.
All right.
Okay, this is right there, at the top of their game before, heroin kind of knocked Jimmy Page off for a little while. I think we need the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the biggest Beatles fan in the world, but we're talking about the eschatological marriage supper of the Lamb rock fest. So of course the Beat.
Plus, at that point, if John Lennon sang "No Religion," it would be like more of a Bardian interpretation of it.
Right. Yeah. Come together. I want them to do that one. I think I'm going to have you too, because, I got to throw in some Christians. I want some Christians. And so, and it would just be like, me doing a favor for Bono, because Bono would just love this. Think how much he would love it. Thank Brian. He would love that. So I got 2 more. And let's try not to be just too predictable. The Stones. I don't need the Stones. I love the Stones. I like the Stones better than the Beatles, but that's just some blues rock. I mean, they do it better than anybody. They do country blues definitely better than anybody. But let's be a little more. This is good. This is really coming from left field. But right now, you just asked me right now, it might change 2 years from now, but I'm on King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard.
Uh-oh.
I don't know if people know about this band. These young Aussies that it's one of the best shows I've ever seen in my life. I saw them at Red Rocks this past summer. My goodness. They just give their all. They give their all. I got one last band. I don't know what the line, I know that the Zeppelin's going to close, but not the Beatles, sorry. It's going to be Zeppelin. What if I put together I know what it is. I got it. It means George Harrison's going to have to play 2 sets, but we're going to have the Traveling Wilburys.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about. That's one of those. Yeah. That's like a cheat code for this game, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They might have to close.
Mm-hmm. Especially if you let them do their songs and pull some of the greatest hits from each.
Yeah, that's the cheat code. And Traveling Wilbury.
Yeah.
Come on now, I nailed that.
Oh no, because Tom Petty would have been on my list anyway. I love Tom Petty in concert.
Oh yeah.
And one time we did a live podcast on the roof of his one of his buildings in Los Angeles, and the Tom Wright, when he showed up, was like, well, how'd y'all arrange this or whatever? And I was like, well, Tom Petty's physical therapist goes to my church, and she talked him into it. And
that's awesome.
He had this look of like, are you just saying random things at me right now? I was like, no, that's
awesome.
That's how it happened. It'd be
time I sat with Tom Wright on top of Tom Petty's building and did a podcast.
Yes. Yeah. And I have to say, the number of times people come in 3-piece suits to live homebrewed podcasts is very small. Yeah. And I thought, I told him, I was like, that you've never worn that outfit and thought you were being edgy before, did you? And he goes, well, wearing dark jeans, a black t-shirt, and having a beard here, it seems like a uniform. Well, everyone has their vibe. But well, thank you so much. This has been a blast. I hope you get an opportunity to organize some Easter Vigil rock fests, because
it It's always fun to talk with you, Trip. Always fun. And I've said this before. I've told you this before. I'm going to say it again. I believe that Homebrewed Christianity was the first podcast I ever listened to. I didn't even know quite what a podcast was. But I found that this guy's interviewing a lot of theologians that I'm interested in. When did you start? It's like
2008.
Okay, that's when I started. I was there at the beginning. Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. 1,700 episodes later, you'll still talk to me. That's good.